Hello there, I'm Miss Amber and I'm here with your English 11B live lesson for today. So today the lesson should be on the fifth lesson in Unit 1, which should be about Imagism, theme in images poetry. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can just get started. Okay, so I've opened this up and we're starting off just on slide number 5, past the objective and everything else. I do want to say before we get started that this lesson has several reading excerpts in it, and some of them are short because imagistic poetry is pretty brief. And there's some examples of things. So I may read some of the example pieces or excerpts from them. Usually I don't go through excerpts because if you need help with understanding an excerpt, you should probably book a tutoring session. I'm just here to go over the information in the tutorial. But since these are short, we're going to fit some of them in there. Some of them are just in the lesson itself, and others you're going to have to click and open. So starting with Poetic Imagism, they explain what Imagism is. So they compare it to the Romantic period and to modernism, because Imagism is part of the modernist movement. So if you remember from earlier lessons, maybe even earlier classes, the Romantic period followed after the age of reason. And basically, it was people getting back to their roots, writing more about individual thought, focusing on nature, and there was a lot of long, flowy descriptions. Now, modernism is part of the period following World War I, and was a response to things that came before, but also the strict rules that came with previous types of writing. So Imagism is a brief movement in American and British poetry. And it also wanted to kind of knock back at old traditional poetry. So instead of having long, flowy descriptions, using beautiful words to paint a picture that's supposed to move you emotionally in a million words, these artists and poets focused on being able to get you to feel things in a direct, punchy kind of writing style. They were influenced by the Japanese haiku, it says here, the ancient Greek lyric poetry, and the French symbolists. And the goal of Imagism was to revive and refresh American poetry. They wanted to show something new. They wanted to shake things up and find a different way of doing things. So Imagism started in the early 1900s and lasted until the beginning of World War I. So this kind of was the bridge between modernism and some of the more formal writing styles before. So the point of Imagism was to present the image of something in an exact, clear, and direct way. Most exact, clear, and direct way possible, without extra wording or abstraction. So straightforward. Some people would call that boring. Some people would say that it's unimaginative, but you have to remember that different writing periods happen in response to each other. So it's not like someone just sat down and was just like, yes, I didn't put any effort into this description. It just is art. No, these people were bridging to other different writing periods. And they were responding to long, formal, flowery things by saying, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to use our skills to carefully pick our words so that we can give you an image without you having to read 3 stanzas to get a picture of what's going on. It's supposed to be challenging. It's a challenging form of writing. How can I create a bold picture in the fewest words possible? So it says here, Imagists experimented with the stanza and line length, line breaks, and even punctuation to ensure that their poems expressed a sparse, clean presentation of an object, word, or event. So that's the definition of Imagism in poetry right there. And then they give you an excerpt from The Great Figure by William Carlos Williams. He and some of the other poets that they give you up here, they give you Ezra Pound, who was very important to the movement, and H.D. or Hilda Doolittle, who was also famous at the time. So the example that they give you, very short poem. Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck. Now, when I read it straight through like that, it sounds like just a normal sentence. Among the rain and the lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck. But when you put the words on the page, you add line breaks to emphasize things. Notice there's a break here at rain. There's a break here at lights, at the 5, the gold, the red. There's emphasis on the things that you can picture in your head here. You can picture rain. You can picture lights in the rain. You can picture what the number 5 looks like. And it says in gold on a red fire truck. Red is here in just as much emphasis as the word gold here, because the last word of a line is something that our brains focus on. So he's giving you the colors to paint the picture yourself in your mind. There are lots of people who could paint a picture of a fire truck in a lot of words. But what he did was try to do it with the fewest words possible, with punchy, straight to the point description. He's pretty accurate. So they talk about the simplicity of the poem. It is simple, and but the important thing is that he's able to put meaning into that simple thing. There's not a lot of lines. There's not any punctuation. So there's no commas where you're supposed to stop and breathe. So that means that you're going to read the poem in a certain way. You're not supposed to take any breaths. So it's supposed to represent how quickly the fire truck itself moves without stopping. If a fire truck is headed towards a fire, it's zooming. That's it. This poem is supposed to give you the idea of the same thing, because there's no periods, there's no commas. And that's sort of what we mean when we're talking about being able to read and interpret a poem. It's not just the words. It's not just the line breaks. It's the reason behind why someone would choose to do that. Poetry is supposed to be something that's done on purpose. Every piece of a poem is supposed to be there on purpose to direct you towards a certain image or a certain way of being able to interpret it. So it says readers are left wondering why such a small moment was captured by the writer, which is exactly the effect that Imagists tried to have on their audience. They attempted to freeze a moment and capture its emotions, carrying the feeling of the moment into their poetry. And I know that seems like a lot to do with like just a couple lines. That poem was only like 6 lines, but that's the point of poetry as an art. You're putting effort into doing it on purpose for meaning. And then down here, it tells you that Imagists focused on using common everyday language, but they used it to create new interesting rhythms in their poetry. Going back to this poem about the fire truck, there's no fancy words here. You don't have to pull out a dictionary to read this. Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck. You know what all those words mean. You don't have to open up anything. You don't have to go on the tab and look at the dictionary. You don't have to do any of that. He managed to make a poem about a fire truck in plain language that everyone can understand, but he did it in a way that made it direct and made it artistic. So that's what the Imagist movement was about. It says the Imagists also attempted to avoid the cliches of writing often found in romantic poetry. So the usual metaphors and pictures, comparing certain colors to things in nature, comparing sounds or giving different things in nature human qualities. They tried to avoid that. They were like, we just want to write poetry that tells you exactly what you're supposed to be seeing, but in a new artistic way. So diction was an important part of Imagism because of this. So the definition of diction really is the specific words that an author or writer chooses in their work. That's pretty much what diction is. The point of them choosing every word carefully is so that they don't have any extras. That's part of the movement. It starts at the top saying, in Ezra Pound's opinion, he was one of the famous authors at the time, he was mentioned in one of the previous slides, imagists wish to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the writing. So you don't want wastefulness. You don't want to have to deal with extraness. They just want what you need to get the picture. It's straight to the point. In order to evoke these feelings for their poetry, Imagist writers focus heavily on their own diction. They thought about every single word and what it does to service the poem. So they give you another short poem by H.D., who is Hilda Doolittle. She was also mentioned on one of the previous slides. She uses repetition and short, terse words. So terse is like serious, kind of like cut short in a way that implies like impatience. So short, terse words to capture the feeling of a moment in time in her poem, The Garden. And the poem reads, "O wind, rend open the heat, cut apart the heat, rend it to tatters." So they ask you what image or emotion comes to mind while you're reading the excerpt. So looking at the words and everything, she chose all of those words on purpose. She did those line breaks on purpose. She did those commas on purpose. So the idea is to look and think, why did she choose those things? Now they break it down here in slide 8. They let you know that it's a picture of extreme heat in the middle of the summer. They're begging, someone is begging the wind to cut the heat. So it's so hot that not even a breeze can cool off the speaker of the poem. It says, by imploring, or like asking, begging, demanding, by imploring the wind to rend or tear the heat into pieces, HD shows the heat as being so oppressive that it seems like a physical object weighing on the speaker. Yeah, to tear something, to rip something, it has to be physical. But we know she's talking about the heat. So she's implying through her words, which are very physical, that the heat is so thick that she feels it like a physical presence near her and next to her. There's also a violent connotation. So rending is like to rip violently. And it's not the same as a word like, or a phrase like pull apart, or just to say to split, to untangle. Rend is like, you're ripping something. So she chose those words on purpose to get the effect of using them. She's trying to offend the heat. She's being violent towards it. She's attacking it with her words because she feels like it's attacking her. Also, the fact that the lines are short give you the impression that she can't even get that many words out in the poem. Whoever the speaker is in the poem, they can't get out that many words because it's so hot, or else the sentences would be longer. There would be more complaining. So they made those choices so that you could get all of these implied things from the words used in the poem. And once you, like, Imagism is a really good example of how to dissect writing because it's short. And the things that are associated with Imagism, like breaking it down like this, those skills can help you break down the other things that you read as well in other classes. When you get to English 12, for example, trying to understand how and why someone chose to describe something the way they did helps get your brain turning to understand the text better. Okay, author approach. This is another section that has examples. And this addresses just being able to tell differences, smaller differences between a longer, more flowy piece of work and something short like this. Now, this says that there are certain themes that are addressed by many authors, even ones in the same era. But based on their background and based on their experience, they might choose to express those things differently in a poem. It says here, identifying similarities and differences in how two authors approach the same theme can help in analyzing the influences and origins of each author's perspective. The author's biological information is also helpful in understanding their viewpoints. Consider the following excerpts from the following poem by T.S. Eliot and Richard Aldington. Now, this just kind of weaves into everything else we've been looking at throughout this semester so far. We have been dealing with and working on understanding the background and history behind the people who are writing and the movements that have been happening. And the reason why we do this is because of this. These explanations are supposed to give you a little bit more insight into how and why people might choose to write things the way that they do. So I'm going to read through these excerpts. We're going to start with The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. April is the cruelest month, breeding, lilacs of the dead land mixing, memory and desire stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. And then from Times Change by Richard Aldington, this is an excerpt. 4 years ago today in Italy, I gathered wild flowers for a girl, thick-scented broom, wild sword flowers, the red anemones that line the ways, and the frail-throated freesia which lives beneath the orange boughs, and whose faint scent to me is love's own breath, its kiss. Today, in sunless barren fields, I gather heads of shells, splinters of shrapnel, cartridges. What shall I gather 4 years from today? Now, immediately, the things that we can tell these two poems have in common is that they both use flowers. So we have lilacs here. That's a type of flower. And in the beginning of this poem, Times Change, we have wildflowers. So on the next slide, they kind of go through these things. In addressing post-World War I devastation, Eliot and Aldington use similar imagery of flowers and the lifeless earth. So I just want to emphasize, both of these authors wrote things during the same time. They both wrote things during the same era, and this poem specifically uses the same kind of image. But those poems are very different, even just going back real quick. You can just look at the length and tell they're different. Not just the length of the sections themselves, but also the length of the lines, the types of the words that they use. The vocabulary is very different. They make connections between emotional memory and flowers. The flowers are recalling things that they know. So these are the things that are similar, and it tells you that they have at least some similar way of thinking in terms of how they associate these things. But the way that they use words to express stuff is different. Eliot's imagery is sparse. Those words are short. So he doesn't give you a whole lot of words to describe one thing. He tells you about lilacs and dried tubers, and he gives you that very direct, punchy picture. Here's what's in the image that you should know about. But Aldington gives you a lot of detailed imagery. Not just detail in terms of more words, but also in what they describe. We get the red anemones that line the ways and frail-throated freesia, which lives beneath the orange boughs. We're getting colors. We're getting not just the flowers. We're getting things on the side of the flower. They live beneath the orange boughs. We're getting colors. We're getting a whole picture of the environment around the flowers. Do we need that to get the picture of the flower? Not necessarily, but this author thought it was important. So it says here, while Eliot's lilacs represent painful buried memories, the flowers in Aldington's poem represent a memory of beauty and peace. And you can tell that by the types of words that are used to describe the flowers in both poems. Eliot's imagery starts with flowers in the beginning, but moves into things that are fading away. We start with lilacs, but from there, it's all downhill. We got dead land, memory and desire stirring, dull roots. It says winter kept us warm, but then we get earth and forgetful snow, and then dried tubers. So dried tubers that's telling us they're dying. It even says a little life. So we start off with something bright like lilacs, and then the picture just sort of fades out into depressing stuff. But here we get very vibrant words that are associated with positive things. So we get that beauty and peace. And Aldington's imagery moves slowly from beauty to horror. So we get that very strong, beautiful impression at the beginning. And then at the end, he kind of he pulls the rug out from under us by comparing it with the recent past in a grotesque sort of way. So looking back at this one more time, we get this whole section about flowers and how beautiful it is. And then the comparison to today. Sunless, barren fields. I gather heads of shells, splinters of shrapnel, cartridges. So we're going from a beautiful memory of flowers to him having to deal with wartime views. What he's seeing at today is not as beautiful as his memory. And he's wondering how it's going to change from 4 years from now. T.S. Eliot doesn't even give us any hope for the future. At least, what shall I gather 4 years from today? We don't know the answer to that, but it could be something good. We actually don't know. T.S. Eliot's poem is just like, nope, this was just bad. This was just bad. It was bad all the way through. And that's great. There you go. So they're approaching their imagery in different ways. And when you know more about them, you can understand why. So they give you a little background on that here. It says these differences on perspective on treatment of the theme of post-war devastation result from differences in the author's personal experiences. Eliot didn't serve in World War I, but he saw the effect that the war had on his country and fellow citizens. However, Aldington did actually serve in World War I. So the differences that we have here is that Eliot wrote about the devastation that he saw from other people. Aldington wrote about the devastation he experienced. He talked about directly seeing the shrapnel picking shells up. You don't do that unless you're actually there. But you can also tell that Aldington seems to at least have the memory of the past to lean back on. And you can tell from his poetry that that was obviously important to him because he included it as part of his description of how he deals with reflecting. He does remember that there were good things. Eliot's poem is basically just about how things just seem awful based on the news that people are getting and what people are going through. There's no real motivation to focus on the good past. That's not the point of his poem. But if you know anyone who's ever served in the army or in any other group, there has to be some sort of positivity to keep people motivated to keep engaging and to fight for their country. And you can see the differences in how they approach their poems based on their backgrounds. So now we're getting into the reading selections. We're not going to go over all of them, but maybe one or two. So they're giving us a little bit of background for the time and things that happened at the same time as Imagism here before we move into the actual examples. So they talk about the Ashcan School. So this was a school of art. It's important to know exactly what the lesson is talking about before you continue moving. So the artists from the Ashcan School were realists whose work was intended to challenge Impressionism. And the reason why you're learning about this is because this is a movement that roughly corresponded to the time frame of Imagism in literature. So this is what was happening in art that's related to what was happening with people's writing at the time. So basically a lot of realist artists were the leading figures of the Ashcan School. And they think basically that they were trying to challenge Impressionism, which is related to the Romantic school of thought. So if you don't know what Impressionism is, I'm going to pull this up on a new tab. Impressionism was characterized by small yet thin visible brushstrokes, open composition, emphasis on accurate depiction of light. So when you're thinking of Starry Night by Van Gogh, that's what most people think of. This is the perfect example of Impressionism, pulling things together and how light works using small brushstrokes and things like that. So they were trying to push back that sort of movement, the Impressionist movement, and they wanted people to do art that reflected real life. It says here, these artists believe in the credo of art for art's sake. I'm sorry, art for life's sake, and not art for art's sake. So what they're trying to say here with art for life's sake is that art education is important. People should be able to learn about art, and art should reflect life and what is happening at the time so that people can be inspired by art and be motivated to do creative things. They basically argue that art is a part of life, so people should continue making art to inspire other people. Now it says artists contributing to this movement portrayed everyday life in New York City at the time, trying to capture the look and feel of the city in a realistic way. So that's related to Imagism because it's a straightforward type of art, just like Imagism is a straightforward type of poem. They take a photo that is art, but it's supposed to represent real life. Poems are art, and in the Imagist movement, they're closer to representing real life. So when we start getting into the readings, we get in a station at the Metro. So they give you some information about Ezra Pound. That's the author. He is considered the founder of Imagism, the person who made it famous, that made it the trend. So he encouraged poets to make it new, which is to try new techniques and experiment with form and meter to create something new, even if you're describing something old. They tell you here that his style referenced a lot of historical figures and trying to reference older things and make them new again, basically. A lot of the Imagist poets name him as an inspiration. So they tell you a little bit about the poem. It's in a station at the Metro is about coming out from a subway car in France. It says the poem was originally a 30-line piece, which he later cut down to 15 lines. A year later, Pound read the following Japanese poem in the form of haiku, which is similar to haiku, and he knew that he could make his poem even more succinct. So he read this poem, The Footsteps of the Cat Upon the Snow, Plum Blossoms. This poem combines the idea of a cat's footprints with that of flowers. Pound stated that his this ability to overlap those two ideas to create one image inspired him to write his final version of the poem, and it is the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow. So you can see he's giving you two different images that overlap in a way. He's comparing them. He's comparing the petals on a wet black bough to the faces in the crowd that come up and pass by while you're coming out of the station. So on this next slide, slide 15, they give you analysis about this poem. The biggest thing is that this poem is a perfect example of Imagism. It's short. It says the poem's brevity. That's a fancy word for shortness. It contributes to its meaning. So like you're walking by, the faces you see only pass for a brief second. So this poem is short to represent that exact feeling of seeing unfamiliar faces that you pass in a crowd. We do this every day, but this poem is supposed to get you to stop and look and think about what it looks like when you're going through a metro station. But he's able to do this and pack a lot of information into that 1 second look that most people do a million times during their lifetimes. They go into some of the diction for the poem. They talk about the fact that he chose the word apparition here. Apparition is how people describe like ghosts or things that appear suddenly. So he's comparing their faces to apparitions because they pop in and out of your view. You're not watching them constantly. They talk about how you could have used the word appearance maybe, but he chose to use apparitions because it's associated with the otherworldly, the ghostly, that phenomenon of you seeing someone's face when you pass them in the subway, but not quite seeing it. Because if someone were to stop you and ask you, oh, what did that young lady, what did that gentleman look like when he passed you a few seconds ago? You wouldn't be able to tell him. They might as well have been a ghost. You barely saw them. And he's drawing attention to that emotion by using that word and by making the poem itself so brief. The poem itself is supposed to capture that split moment. It's such a small moment that we don't even pay attention to it when it happens. If we were to ask ourselves how many people we pass walking, on the train, on the bus, you wouldn't be able to give a number. And the way that our brains kind of block out that commotion when we're not directly focusing on it is meant to be represented in the poem. There's also not a firm outcome. There's an apparition. It's compared to the petals. But that's it. There's no conclusion. And that also was done on purpose. There's no outcome because everything is different to all of the passengers. Maybe the person who's speaking in this poem noticed everyone for a split second, but everyone else is just living their lives. Once they leave the station, they got their own stuff to do. There's no conclusion to have because there's so many different people involved. Everyone's lives overlap for that one moment that you look up and notice that everyone is there. But after that, it all falls apart again. And that's the point of the poem. So now we're gonna go over William Carlos Williams. The most important thing to know about him as a character, I'm sorry, as a author, is that he pursued medicine and also writing. It says here at the bottom, Williams says that his two careers were complementary. As a writer, I have been a physician, and as a physician, a writer. So his influence in the medical field and in the sciences affected some of his language choice and things like that. He was obviously very well educated if he was a doctor, and he was a friend of Ezra Pound's. So this next section doubles back to go over some of the factors and characteristics of Imagism again. They just want you to focus on painting a picture from words. They give you in a station of the metro again, the apparition of faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And the picture on the right is supposed to be a version that someone could picture from like a station that they're at. So this slide basically gives you an idea of how to interpret these sort of poems. It says one way to understand an image is to create a drawing or some other visual representation of it. Over here, that's basically what they're talking about. If you're reading an Images poem, try to picture what it is they want you to picture and think about what sort of things you might notice or might not notice that were included in the poem. And that'll help you kind of unravel the why. So this next poem is by William Carl Williams, and it is called The Red Wheelbarrow. It is very, very short. Okay, literally, right here. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. That's it. That's the whole poem. Now it says, note how Williams spent two of his carefully chosen words on color, red and white. It seems mundane, but they bring the image into focus, as you can see here on the left. Wheelbarrows come in very many varieties. Williams mentions a red one specifically, though. And he's mentioning it because he figures that most people have seen a red wheelbarrow. It is a common color. And he's hoping that everyone can have a picture in their head of the wheelbarrow. It's the same of using the word white when he uses the word chickens. Chickens are different colors. There are brown ones, there are black ones, there are like marbled ones, but he's using the word white in relation so that you can picture that in your mind. He chose those words close together in those lines on purpose to sort of trigger your brain into forming a photo. Now, they talk about on this slide, slide 21, alliteration and repetition of different sounds. So they mark the repeated sounds in the poem for you. A red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. So they're giving you information about how the lines pair together. Alliteration connects key terms like wheel, water, and white. And then you also have barrow and beside. But there's also internal associations to be made too. Beside the white chickens. So we have all of that going on too. There's also assonance. So that's when you have repeated vowel sounds. So we have much, upon, we've got glazed and rain. And it's not just the sounds that come out here, it's also how you say them. Glazed with rain. The A in glazed and the A in rain are similar. So those sounds are playing with each other. He chose these words on purpose to get those sounds, to get that image. Okay, and then we have one more, which is Elizabeth Bishop's The Fish. Now, to give you some background on Elizabeth, she was born into a wealthy New England family. She went to college and she studied. That's pretty much it. She traveled abroad and ended up settling in Brazil and taught at a school. That's pretty much it. Now, The Fish is another short poem, so we're going to go over that really quick. It is actually a little longer than some of the other ones, but we can go over it anyway. Hang on, let me see. I think they go over some of it here. Nope. Okay, here we go. Okay, yes. So we'll go over some of the excerpts from the analysis because that one's a little long. So we have Elizabeth's style is a little more flowing and descriptive. Obviously, you can tell by the lines than William Carlos Williams. But she also tries to capture the moment, basically modifying simple words to make them seem a little more fancy and trying to make things more evocative, so like to pull out emotions that way. So it says, Bishop delves into extreme detail, but if you look here at this example, there's still a lot of color here, the same way that there is in Williams's stuff and in Ezra's stuff. So the variation of color gives you an image that this fish is just colorful in general. It's not a simple image of just one thing that is one color. They give you information about what the fish looks like on all parts of its body. So the excerpt they give you here is the dramatic reds and blacks of his shiny entrails and the pink swim bladder like a big peony. I looked into his eyes, which were far larger than mine, but shallower and yellowed. There's a lot of colors in here. We have reds, blacks, pinks. We've got yellow in here. We've also got some, flower imagery. A peony is a flower. So there's just a lot going on. And then there's also sound repetition. This slide goes off of one of the excerpts and highlights the different sounds and how they repeat. They coded everything by color, and you can see how many times those sounds repeat in these lines. But basically, she's still describing, like a regular moment in life. And I think that that's the thing that's hard to tell at first when you're looking at it because it's long. But the fish is about her pulling a fish. She's, people fish all the time. When you pull a fish out of the water, it's a very exciting moment. But she tries to make it a moment that sort of burns in the mind of the reader, even though it's something that people go through all the time. The goal is for it to make a lasting impression. Ezra Pound once said that Imagism isn't supposed to be realism. It's supposed to be real. It's real, not realism. You're not trying to make things seem realistic for other people. You are actually reporting on what was real in that moment. It is real. What you are writing is real. So that's how she describes the fish in this poem. She tries to get the moment to feel exactly the way it would if you were there fishing. Let's see. I think that's actually it. Yes. Okay. So that's about it for this lesson. So there's this focus on language. And as I tell everyone, it's important for you to write down vocabulary, especially if you don't know it. You don't have to write down every single part of this chart here, but I would write down the word in the part of speech and I would at least get the definition, especially if it's words that you know you don't know or that you might need to look up later. Because usually if these are coming up here in the lesson, you're going to be asked a question about it on the test, or it's going to come up in something that you're reading soon. Okay. And the rest of the questions, I'm pretty sure, yeah, are just about the vocabulary. Alrighty, let me go ahead and stop sharing. Okay, as usual, I am Miss Amber. This was the English 11B lesson. And what I would like to do is just remind you guys that if you need help with the excerpt, there was literally only one excerpt that we didn't go in depth with today. But if you need help with this or any of the other excerpts, please send me an email. You can email the English department at english@atsedu.net. You can also show up at the help desk. You guys get the link to that in your weekly newsletters. And that will be it. The help desk runs from 11 to 3. Yep. And you can also always schedule a tutoring session with a tutor if you need help with something else. All right. I think that that's about it for me. This is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with the rest of your English class.